Let's go back to your calls. Hassan from Slough. Welcome back, Hassan.
Hi, Salams. Thanks very much.
Salam.
Yes, I just want to start off by saying that everyone wants the lockdown to be ended. We all want to go back to our normal lives.
Some people don't, Hassan. Some people want to carry it on.
Yeah, sure. And it's always a difficulty to try and get the balance between livelihoods, which is important, as well as lives, saving lives. So as to whether the government will lift the restriction permanently, they wouldn't have a choice but to lift the restriction. It will depend on the medical advice, I think, because they're still monitoring the development of...
Advice from whom, Hassan?
The medical advisors.
From SAGE?
Yeah, from SAGE.
The same people that gave the government out-of-date data?
Sorry?
The same people that gave the government out-of-date data?
Well, hopefully they've learned their lesson and will give up to date.
That wasn't the first time, though. Have you looked at their track record? Every single prediction SAGE has made has been wrong. Look up, Hassan, if you look up Professor Philip Thomas's article in The Spectator about this, he goes through every single time they've made predictions. In particular, Professor Neil Ferguson, going back to even mad cow disease, every single prediction that man has made, Professor Ferguson, has been wildly off the mark and fear-mongering. Now, the reason for that is the modelling. And you make slight adjustments in the modelling, and it makes a huge difference in the outcomes, because the modelling is incredibly sensitive. And I want to go back to something you said at the beginning of your sentence and ask you, the balance about lives and livelihoods. We just had a professor on Toby Green on our show earlier. I don't know if you caught that segment with Professor Toby Green from King's College.
I think I did, yes, I did.
And he's published research in his latest book, but this is something which, through multiple peer-reviewed studies, is already established, and that is that it's a false dichotomy to talk about lockdown being a balance between lives and livelihoods. It's an absolute false dichotomy, because indeed the real balance through lockdown is whether you kill more people than save by locking down. That's the real question. And we got all the... I've got a list here right in front of me of around 30 peer-reviewed studies. Stanford, for example, effects on MPI and COVID-19, a tale of 3 models. That's a comparative study. Lancet paper, no effect on mortality. A German paper, was lockdown in Germany necessary? Koch Institute, Germany analysis. Bristol University paper. Nature magazine, submission. Flaxman et al. Response. There's around 30 of them. I won't go through all of them. It's an overwhelming consensus in at least these peer-reviewed studies, and Professor Toby Green referred to it on our show today, that when you look at lockdown, in terms of the impact assessment, more quality of life years are lost through lockdowns than saved. And so the balance about lives and livelihoods is a false dichotomy. We should be looking at lives and lives. Do we save more people through lockdown, or do we end up inadvertently killing more people through lockdown?
I think that's a very powerful argument to lift the lockdown and keep it unrestricted permanently. I mean, I have not come across those papers, and if you're saying they're peer-reviewed, because that will be vital, because anyone can come out in any study, but it has to be peer-reviewed and agreed medically. In which case, the question I would then ask SAGE is, what is their opinion about these peer-reviewed studies? Are they going to change their opinion? So,
yeah, indeed. Good question. I mean, I'd like to ask SAGE a lot of questions. I mean, but one thing I do wonder, Hassan, when we talk about what the science says, see, the data at the moment, what we do know is flu and pneumonia. I kept saying flu and influenza, but obviously when you're riffing sometimes, you get a brain confusion. Flu and pneumonia deaths are now 10 times higher than COVID. And so, again, when you talk about data, Hassan, I do wonder if, and you're a reasonable man, you're a regular caller, and I enjoy every time you call, and thank you. I do wonder if the data begins to change your the trust that you have in SAGE when all of this kind of information is coming from scientists that are outside of SAGE. And the history with the lab leak hypothesis and now ivermectin, which Oxford University has now finally decided to study as a potential prophylactic. Is there a question around, and I don't know if you caught when we had last weekend, we had evolutionary biologist Brett Weinstein on, who specialises in bats, talking about the danger of politicised science. And I put the question to him that I put to you. I know you're a civil servant, so be careful how you, for your own sake, I don't want you to say anything you're uncomfortable with, but the question
I'm not a civil servant.
Oh, but you work in Prevent.
Prevent I used to, yes. Okay, I used to be a trainer, but the disbanded. You see,
I remember. Well, I'm sorry you lost the gig, but the point I was making actually is, well, that means now you are free to answer this openly. I just didn't want to put you at risk with your employment. But the question I put to you is that these officials who are hired by government, even if they're scientists, do we need to look at them as, first and foremost, as public officials who we have to mistrust like we mistrust any public official if we're doing our job as opposition and media, or do we see them first and foremost as scientists, which would indicate we trust them first and foremost? They're still scientists, obviously. My view is that any scientist that gets given a public political role is first and foremost a public official that should be handled with skepticism because they're obeying political masters first and foremost, even though they're also scientists. What's your view?
That's a really good understanding of it, I think. When you use the term they would obey the political masters, my hope would be that the political masters would actually listen to these scientists purely from a scientific angle. So I hope that dynamic would actually be that rather than scientists listening to the government masters being first and foremost public servants. So, I mean, what you said is really
Have you heard of Peter Daszak?
Sorry?
Have you heard of Peter Daszak?
No.
So you know the WHO delegation that went to China?
Yes.
That was a scientific delegation. This is an illustration of the point that I've just put to you. So Peter Daszak was on the World Health Organization that went to China to investigate the origins of the lab leak hypothesis, and of course came under the Chinese government narrative that there was no lab leak, and that WHO delegation then reported that to much controversy. Now, Peter Daszak was the man who organised the collection of scientists who sent a letter to Lancet Journal, which you would have heard of, where they signed last year a letter dismissing the lab leak hypothesis and declaring anybody suggesting that it was a case to be a conspiracy theorist. These were scientists. Turns out Peter Daszak had a conflict of interest because he was funded by the federal government in the United States via Fauci. NIH, the National Institute of Health, funded Daszak as president of EcoHealth Alliance to engage in gain-of-function research in Wuhan. Now, that research was the research that people are suspecting led to the leak from that lab that caused COVID. So the man that received funding to do the work wrote to Lancet saying there was no lab leak hypothesis and was on the WHO delegation to go and investigate himself when he went to China. And that's what I mean, yeah? These are scientists, but they're also in public roles covering their own tracks.
Yeah. And I think scientists should remain resolutely scientists and not be influenced by public funds or public policy. You're absolutely right. And Lancet, in past history, has actually retracted 2 articles in its history. So this might be the third one. Yeah. So the data and the information you put forward is actually very good. And as you said, you encourage people to use their critical faculties, and I certainly will exercise that and look into this further. All I'll say then is that SAGE must look into those peer-reviewed data. As far as the government is concerned, they have to listen to scientific advice, whether it's SAGE or a totality of the other data you've mentioned. I just wanted to say something about Matt Hancock.
Go for it.
You know well, your listeners know well, my political affiliation with the Tories. So my opinion might seem very biased, but I'll try to be as independent as I can. Yeah. I don't believe Matt Hancock should resign because if we're using the argument that he should be treated equally as everyone else, which is true, no one is above the law. If you and I broke the COVID law, we would be fined. So if we think about a punishment, a fine would be appropriate. But another reason he should not resign is because he's presided over a very successful vaccine program. Yes, there were mistakes made last year, but as a result, hundreds of thousands of lives are being saved. And as a health secretary, he should oversee that. That's why I disagree with my fellow Conservative compatriots, Esther McVeigh and Duncan Baker. And final point, you had a call from Adam from Bolton. Well, he was an investment banker and then joined the NHS. He said he had a resignation letter ready, which is going to submit on Monday. My heartfelt advice to him is not to submit the resignation letter because his work in the NHS is, I assume, will make a difference to the lives of patients that he is serving. What he's doing in the NHS is not affecting Matt Hancock. It is affecting the patients. So he should still remain within the NHS. He should not resign.
Have you considered the role? I take your point, but I think that there's an element that I would advise that you look at to develop that point. And that is, have you considered the role of the ministerial code and collective cabinet responsibility? There are ethics through the ministerial code that members of the cabinet have to adhere to that are higher than the ethics that you and I have to adhere to by definition because we're not cabinet members.
Yeah. Yes, I'm aware of that, yes. And
do you think Hancock broke the ministerial code?
It's difficult to say. I mean, he's broken the COVID rules, so in which case I'll just reiterate the point I made. But if, based on your discussion with other people, that, there's some cronyism and favoritism and other, favoritism, using family members, giving them contracts, okay, that is a different issue altogether, and I certainly would need to look into that, and that would need to be investigated, and I think there is an investigation going on.
Yeah, there is. So thank you, Hassan, by the way. Thank you for this very civil disagreement. Just the paper that I referenced, just to repeat it again, if you look it up for yourself, you can have a look at that. Professor Philip Thomas from Bristol University, professor in risk management, wrote for The Spectator, comparing his modelling with Neil Ferguson of Sage's modelling. And it's worth looking at that because it really does demonstrate the point that I think it's time for these restrictions to be lifted. And the data quite clearly, from my perspective, indicates that. Now,